What we're going to do is Katrina and I will take about maybe 35 minutes between the two of us together. I'll begin by saying a few words about the book, general themes, how I came to write it. Katrina was along for the entire making of this book, and she has some perspectives and some experiences that differed from mine. And I'm going to begin my remarks where the book actually ends, with a struggle underway in Moscow today. This book is the story of monstrous crimes committed by Stalin, and yet Russia today is engaged in a national debate over Stalin's historical reputation. Polls tell us that about half the nation think he was a genocidal murderer, and the other half think he was a great and wise leader, perhaps the greatest leader in Russian history. This is actually the third national debate Russia has had about Stalin. After his death, his successor Khrushchev partially revealed Stalin's crimes, and in conditions of censorship, there was a kind of Soviet national debate, which lasted until Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964. Then when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, by 1989, the whole nation was again engaged in a debate about Stalin, but this time without any censorship. By then, Gorbachev had ended the censorship. That ended as the Soviet Union fell apart, and now a new debate, as we talk, in the daily newspapers, virtually every day, who, what was Stalin? Clearly, Stalin and the Stalin experience remains an open wound in Russia, something that the nation cannot close with some consensual perspective or reduce those who feel one way or the other to an inconsequential minority. Now, back in the 1970s, as a very young man, I stumbled into this open wound in Moscow, into this national debate, when I found myself living in Moscow among the people who cared the most about how the nation resolved this debate, survivors of Stalin's terror, survivors of his concentration camps, prisons, and exiles, settlements, that Solzhenitsyn called the Gulag archipelago. Having met those people quite inadvertently led me to a series of experiences that led eventually, 35 years later, to this book. Now you may immediately say, why would it have taken me 35 years to write a 200-page book? And I'll say a word about that. But let me begin with the history and nature of the book, and then Katrina will say what she can bring to this discussion, and then I'll return very briefly to try to explain why Stalin is again a subject of national controversy. Now, when we talk about survivors of Stalin's terror, of the Gulag, we have to put aside a misconception. Even educated people, when they hear Stalin's terror, tend to think of those 3 years at the end of the 1930s, when he unleashed the terror on the Soviet political class, staged those famous Moscow trials. One was the subject of Arthur Koestler's famous novel, which many of us read many years ago, Darkness at Noon, and destroyed the founding elite of the Soviet Union. But the terror lasted much longer. It began, in effect, with Stalin's assault on the peasantry. Then about 80% of the Soviet population in 1929. He used violent means to force the peasantry to give up its small plots and go into collective farms. Millions of peasants died. Then in the 30s came the political terror that hit virtually every city in the Soviet Union. And when Stalin died, he had, on the eve of his death, begun a new scenario or chapter in his terror, an anti-Jewish terror, a pogrom called the Doctor's Plot, or the Anti-Cosmopolitan Campaign. And only his death stopped that from growing into another mass terror. In other words, we're dealing here with a 25-year terror, and we don't know, because it lasted so long, and because so many people died, exactly how many people actually died in the terror. It's true that many archives, though not all of them, have been opened. It's also true that scores of Western and Russian scholars have gone in those archives looking for answers about the mechanism of the terror, the dimension. But there is no magic or immediate or conclusive answer in the archives. Many of the documents there were falsified originally. You get a document, it has figures on it. If the figures were falsified, as a friend of mine says, rubbish in, rubbish out. We just don't know. I think, and I take a kind of middling figure, 20 million died. That would count the peasants, the people who died in the terror, but it excludes the 26.5 Soviet citizens who died as casualties in World War II. Those would not be included in this count. So about 20 million, a lot of people. During these years, about 12 million, maybe 14 million, survived the initial taking, as they said, the arrest, to be dispatched into the Gulag of prisons, concentration camps, and exile over this 25-year period. There were many ways to die in the terror. Many people died beaten to death in prisons because it was part of the process to force them to sign forced confessions. Many were immediately shot. Many were sentenced to immediate death, shot in the prisons, shot in killing fields that the Russians are still digging up today. When Stalin died in 1953, and this is a fairly precise figure because here a series of archive documents concur, about 5.5 million people were still alive in the Gulag. And they are the victims returned, the subject of my book. But most of those people had relatives who had not been arrested, but who were stigmatized during all those years as members of families of enemies of the people or traitors to the motherland. Katrina and I knew many of these people, spouses, children, even parents, even grandparents. And those who had been stigmatized were victims in the sense that they were unable to partake even in the meager benefits of the Soviet system under Stalin. Many were forbidden to attend university. Many were forbidden to live in the capital cities, the cultural cities of Russia. Many were denied social benefits, health care, pensions, things like that. So if we take a rough guess at about 3 relatives per victim who survived and returned, we're talking about 15 million people in the 1950s, under Khrushchev, after Stalin's death, are suddenly released. And they go home, or they try to go home, because for many of them, there was no longer any home. Now, one thing that makes this book unusual is we know quite a bit about survivors of the Jewish Holocaust. We have a lot of big literature on it. I'm sure right here in the store there may even be a special section on it. But we have novels and memoirs and scholarly studies. We have some sense of what happened to those who survived the Jewish Holocaust. There were even more survivors of Stalin's terror. I don't mean to make an equation between the Holocaust, though some have, and Stalin's terror. The point is we just don't know much about all these millions of people who were victims of a kind of Soviet Holocaust. And I ended up with this story to tell. When the New Yorker reviewed this book, they called it a memoir. And I hadn't actually thought I was writing a memoir when I did the book, though I knew, of course, that it was autobiographical, and that Katrina and I knew most of the people that I write about in an intimate way. You can tell in these pages which people I actually knew and which I read about, because it's a melody of sources. People have asked me, how did a kid, a guy, who grew up in Kentucky, end up living in Moscow among Stalin's victims, survivors of the terror? And the American answer, because that's the kind of people we are, is, oh, it was chance. It was by chance. The Russian answer is different. Russians say it was your судьба, your fate. And the more people Katrina and I met, the more we were told this was your fate, to know us and now to write about us, because at that time the subject was forbidden, and they really didn't expect that their story would ever be told. In 1976, when I was a professor at Princeton, I was participating on a Academy of Sciences exchange program with the Soviet Union. And I would go to the Soviet Union to live 2 to 4 months about every other year, whenever I could weasel out of teaching or raise leave money. Academics know how this is done. And prior to that, though, about 2 years before, I had published a biography of Nikolai Bukharin, who was one of the most eminent founding fathers of the Soviet Union, killed by Stalin. It turned out that Bukharin's widow, 25 years younger than he, Anna Lorna, had survived the terror. She'd been arrested in 36. She'd spent the next 20 years in jails, camps, and eventually in remote Siberian exile. Her 1-year-old son, Bukharin's son Yuri, was taken from her when she was arrested in 37 and vanished. It turned out he grew up in an orphanage run by the NKVD in Stalingrad, of all places, under a different name. He had no idea who he was. They met, they reunited in the 1950s, and they were now living in Moscow. So when I began participating on the exchange, my home away from home became the home of the Bukharin family. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I realized that my nightlife at their house and where they took me on social events was made up almost exclusively of other people who had survived Stalin's terror or the relatives of people who had died in the terror. So I realized that I was living in a kind of subterranean world of survivors. Their existence and their story, now forbidden in the 70s, this was the Brezhnev era, to be told in the Soviet Union, and almost unknown in the West. So it began to dawn on me, to put it crudely, this was a good subject. But also it was one, as these people came forward to tell me their stories in the sort of underground environment of kitchens and, you know, being careful, that they wanted me to do it. In 1980, Katrina became my life companion. We've been together 30 years, and thus my partner in this venture in Moscow. She began to live with me on the exchange in Russia. And she brought to the project, because it had become a project by 1980, a bunch of things. First of all, she had an interest in victims because she had written about and worked on television documentary about, read a lot about victims of McCarthyism. She never equated the two, but the process of victimization was of interest to her. Secondly, as you see, she's younger, and therefore she had better or more closer generational relations with the younger victims, the children of the people. So this combination meant that we were now a team. Also, we could just do more together. And she kept notes, and really, she was my co-author of this book. We probably should have at some point just done it together. Now, you know that those were the 70s and early 80s, very repressive times in the Soviet Union. Censorship was very tight. People were not being arrested and shot anymore, but the KGB was a mean-spirited organization. It was perfectly willing to take administrative reprisals against people who didn't behave. So we worried, Katrina and I did, that the victims who had befriended us, and even more their children, the younger ones, would be punished for hanging out with us. It could be they'd lose their job, it could be that their children would be denied permission to university. All sorts of sort of petty things were possible. So Katrina and I were very, very careful, which is to say we were surreptitious. We followed certain rules. Don't talk on the telephone. Don't leave documents in your hotel or your apartment. Don't mention one returnee survivor to another unless they already knew each other. Just be careful. There were simple rules of the game, and we followed them. Nonetheless, in 1982, we were in effect kicked out of the Soviet Union. We left to go home, and we weren't allowed to come back. We were refused visas, and for 3 years, we remained outside the Soviet Union. I thought I had enough material to start the book, and I wrote a kind of 25 perspectives of what I imagined the book would look like one day. Then came Gorbachev in 1985, and you all, looks to me like we have a demographic here, maybe with one exception. Remember the way the news out of Moscow just poured across the United States. We were all drawn into this torrent of developments that began with democratization, ended with the end of the Soviet Union. Katrina and I were given our visas back as soon as Gorbachev came to power. We began living in the Soviet Union again a lot. The more Gorbachev reduced the censorship, the more victims of Stalin's terror we met. We now could identify them publicly because they were allowed to speak, but even more, we had become a kind of legend. People knew about us and began to seek us out because their fear factor was declining. So we continued to collect material, and we did through the 80s and the 90s, but I put aside the book for all sorts of reasons that when I look back now don't make a lot of sense. One was current events. We were just drawn into what was happening inside the Soviet Union and then in post-Soviet Russia. Katrina became editor of The Nation, which is by definition current events. I went to work for CBS in the late 80s as its Russia consultant, which meant I had to busy myself while teaching history with the news. We had a child. We each, together we wrote a book, and we individually wrote other books. So this book really, I think, it faded from my life. It existed in cartons of materials, notebooks Katrina kept, in my Princeton office. Then I moved it all to New York, to my New York office, to 19 University Place. Remnants of it are still there. And then something happened in 2007, nothing particularly dramatic, that made me go back and look at that 23-page document I had written in 1983, and I got hooked. I just realized there had been no closure at all. Moreover, I guess there had always been an uneasy feeling in me that I hadn't taken on a commitment to write this story. There had been some writing about it subsequently, but not of the kind that I thought I could do, and as authors always think, need to be done. So I returned to the book 3 years ago, but then I saw it somewhat differently. Originally, I had intended a really thick scholarly book, one of these doorstoppers, these 400-page books. It was all in my head, it was all laid out. When the New York Times reviewed this book, the reviewer faulted me for not writing that book, that thick book. Maybe so, I don't know. I'm content, but who's to say which would have been the best way to go? It's a small book about a big subject. That was one decision I made, to make it a kind of overview, but with enough personal detail so people came alive, to make the overview substantive, not abstract, but so you could see the general experience that millions had through the lives of a small number of people. Secondly, I realized as I grew older that there was something missing in this story. You couldn't write about the victims without writing about the people who had victimized them, because when they came home, millions of other people were afraid of them and what it might mean if the truth about what had happened to them was told. Not just people who had actively denounced them or participated in their arrest or tortured them, but people who had been passive profiteers of the terror, who had taken their apartments or had been given their apartments, or who had been promoted in an institution where the bosses had been arrested. People even had married wives of people who vanished. Some even adopted their children. So a whole generation, maybe 2 generations of Soviet citizens had made lives and careers on the terror. Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet, whom many of you know, you probably have her books here. Her son, Lev Neto, was in the Gulag in 1956 when Khrushchev opened the gates. And Anna Akhmatova turned to her close friend, a close friend who wrote down everything she said, knowing she was a great poet, and she said this, she said, now those who were arrested will return, and 2 Russias will be eyeball to eyeball. The Russia that put people in the camps and the Russia that was put in the camps. This became one of my themes, the confrontation of the 2 Russias. And Akhmatova went on to say the first are now trembling for their names, their positions, their apartments, their dachas. The whole calculation was no one would ever return. And that is true. Their return was a kind of shock, not only to people who were innocent, who simply, you know, these were curious people, suddenly risen from the dead. Even Stalin's daughter said, it's as though the dead have come back to life. But to the people who had known them, or who had known about them, or who had been profited from the victimization, it was a shock. So my narrative follows this as well, this story, and it reaches all the way into the leadership, because Khrushchev, who, as he said, had blood on his hands up to his elbows, was surrounded by people who had even more blood on them and had no repentance in their soul. Khrushchev had to become a repentant man, or he wanted to repent. But the powerful people around him wanted none of this. So this confrontation over what had happened existed at the highest leadership, highest level. The third decision I made, and this is because this open wound won't close, is I had figured on ending the story with Khrushchev's overthrow in '64. But more and more I realized that though many of the victims were dying, and most of them are now dead, the older ones who came back, a few were alive in Moscow, their children and their grandchildren remain and still want some kind of historical justice. Not to mention the fact that if legally declared relatives of the victims, they get an enhanced pension and other benefits. But I realized the story hadn't ended. So what I've done in this book is try to drive it, though I spend more time back on the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, drive it right into the present, with Putin and Medvedev taking somewhat different positions on this. And finally, I had written a lot of books for my fellow academics. I tried to make this book what Russians call a little more dostupен, a little more accessible to people who didn't know Russia, because it did seem to me in the end this was less a story about Russia, though inseparable from Russia, than a human story. I can't say whether I did it well. I would only say to you that we have a 19-year-old daughter who has made a kind of program of not reading anything either of us wrote, but she relented, or we sort of forced her to read this book. She's now at university, and I asked her what she thought about it, and she said, "It's okay, Dad." And being that's about the highest compliment either of us have ever gotten out of her, "It's okay," at least that's a modest success. So let Katrina now say a few words about her perspective on this and people she knew, and then let me end by saying briefly a word about why this Stalin question is back.
Thank you. I brought a very different experience than Steve to this question because I am not a scholar of Russia. I am a journalist, but I was a participant in many of these adventures or misadventures. And Steve will come back to the present, but as we sit here tonight, and I hear the subway rumbling, I think of how this debate over Stalin and his fate and reputation in Russia rages from newspapers, where the debate goes on every day, even on television, as to whether he was a monstrous criminal or someone who modernized the state, to fights over subways opening, where they opened one, a few months ago, and they had a frieze, a panel, showing Stalin and his various achievements. So this fight rages on. It rages on in ways that it did not when Steve and I first arrived in Moscow. I first arrived. Steve first went in 1959. I first went in 1978, and then we went back in 1980. But those were, as Steve said, those were underground years. Those were years of repression, authoritarianism. Not that we experienced the repression, but we were very, as Steve said, very sensitive to those of our Russian friends who might. And at times, though Steve didn't mention this, Steve would do an act of kindness, which would lead to, for example, a friend being sent to prison for a few years. Steve, as a scholar, sent the full cycle of the Menshevik journal, Dnevnik, to a man in Leningrad, a man who now runs one of Russia's leading human rights organizations. And it was a favor this man had asked him for months, Steve, right? And you gathered them and you shipped them against all odds. But he was picked up just days after receiving these journals. So our conversations with many of the people Steve writes about in this book, people we knew, took place in tiny apartments in Moscow, in small kitchens, often with tables laden with vodka, with food, with friends who would put pillows over phones or put pencils in phones, thinking that that would stop the KGB from tapping our conversation, or using those children's sketch-pads. You'd write a note, lift it up so no one would see what we had exchanged. And these were people, almost everyone in this book could be not just part of Steve's autobiography, not a memoir, but I would argue that almost every character in this book, because they're such personal human tales, they're like characters in a Russian novel. There's a tragedy, there's a grandeur, there's a colorful quality. I think particularly of the story of a man named Lev Neto, who was coming back from the Gulag on a train in 1956 when his brother Igor was leading the Soviet Olympic team to a gold medal in Melbourne. And you think of these families who were ripped apart, and yet we saw some of them who came back together with grace and forgiveness. I want to speak and read from Steve's book very briefly about two characters from what I think of as the underground years. And then come into the Gorbachev years and two characters from that period. One of these people is a man from the underground years who is still very much alive in Moscow at age 92, runs the first state museum of the Gulag in the center of Moscow. This is a man whose father, the legendary Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko, led the Bolshevik seizure of power, seized the Winter Palace in Petrograd in 1917, later died in Stalin's prisons. And like many grown children of Stalin's leading victims, our friend Anton had himself sat in the Gulag for almost 13 years, an experience that shaped almost everything he did later, from his prosecutorial writings and the risks he took to his several marriages and choice of friends. This man, Anton, is nearly blind, wiry, extraordinarily determined, continues to be capable of boundless research and writing, as well as an astonishing number of chin-ups at age 92. And like another former Zek, someone I know you've heard of, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This man is embattled, willful, and overly confident in his Gulag-acquired cunning. As his friendship with Steve developed, his frequent requests for assistance in exposing Stalinist hangmen, past and present, sometimes worried Steve. But Anton was admired and trusted by many Gulag survivors, and he too persuaded Steve to help him. Another character in this period, Steve calls her his third enabler. One was Anton, the other was a well-known historian named Roy Medvedev, who at 85 is still alive and writing. And Tanya Medvedev, a remarkable woman who sat down on Red Square to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But she wasn't arrested because her father had become a famous biochemist, very high in the Soviet Academy of Sciences in the 1970s. Her father wouldn't talk to her for years because he had sat for 17 years in the Gulag and didn't want his reputation or career destroyed by a daughter who was determined to be a dissident at a time in Brezhnev's Russia when it wasn't the safest thing to be. Steve writes of her apartment filled with samizdat underground documents, laden with manuscripts and forbidden books published abroad, became a regular meeting place for human rights activists and other dissidents. Among them were middle-aged survivors of the terror, especially men smitten with Tanya's exotic looks, worldly manner, and aura of a keeper of many secrets. These were two people from the underground years, and they remain part of our lives, but in a very different Russia, because as you know, as Steve mentioned, in 1985, Gorbachev comes to power. He launches what became known as perestroika and glasnost. And glasnost, the ending of the censorship, the unraveling of the censorship, opened the floodgates. Opened the floodgates to revelations in every day the Russian media, in newspapers, in television, in the theater, in movies, TV shows, popular culture, in art exhibits. Gulag revelations and the Gulag survivors became kind of the heroes of this moment. Young people were drawn into this because I think many young people understood that a country without a history is like a person without a memory. And young people would organize evenings of remembrance. We went to a few where they would toast and listen to those, either the survivors or the family members of survivors. And I was covering this moment for The Nation, and I remember going to Gorky Park, and thousands of people were streaming into the park one afternoon, many of them older people, many of them survivors, visibly, or family members of survivors, and then there were young families with their babies or toddlers coming to hear about a history that had for so long been suppressed. And at this same time, a movement arose, maybe a movement you've heard about or read about in the papers, a movement called Memorial. It has become known as a human rights organization designed to protest the abuses of the war in Chechnya. It was designed originally to fulfill the promise made by Nikita Khrushchev in 1961 to build a memorial to the victims of Stalinism. And then in 1987, Gorbachev repeated this promise, And just 2 years ago, the editor of the leading opposition newspaper, a man named Dmitry Muratov, a newspaper which is partly owned by Gorbachev, had an interview, first print interview with President Medvedev, and he promised he would build a memorial. 2 years later, it is not built, which I think suggests, and Steve will speak to, the ongoing struggle over the issue of Stalin and memory. But Memorial was founded in that period, and it continues to play a role. Our lives also changed. Steve became involved in covering, thinking about the Gorbachev period. His book, Bukharin, he will be modest about it, but Gorbachev has said that in many ways it contributed to his launching perestroika. Many people hold Steve responsible for this terrible act, which I went to work at a leading newspaper called Moscow News, leading Glasnost newspaper, and I had the good, not good, but it was an important experience as now editor of The Nation to watch the crusading editor of that paper cross the street every week. It was a weekly newspaper, to fight with the censors to get into the newspaper new material, much of it relating to the Stalin experience, new revelations. And extraordinary individuals appeared at this time. And let me just finish with two characters. I mentioned two from a different period, but there was a man named Sasha Milchikov. Sasha Milchikov was himself the son of someone who did survive, someone who was a leader of the Young Communist League, someone who had been in the Gulag for many years. And this man wanted to help those who had come back and who wanted to know what had happened to their father, to their grandfather, and who needed to find information that wasn't being given by the government. And this man had a conscience and wanted to be helpful. And this man was a small, disheveled, incongruously jovial man in his mid-50s who always wore an ill-matching suit, even while trudging through muddy grave sites, perhaps to assure, as Steve writes, alarmed secret police and cemetery authorities that he was a professional journalist. Steve would follow him around. In fact, you and Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes once spent a day with this man, Sasha Milchikov, as he showed them the crematorium, those where people had been killed. And this man, Milchikov, created a sensation in 1988 with pioneering articles exposing the KGB's mass graves in Moscow. What he would do is find the mugshots, the places of execution, the burial places, and he published in this regional newspaper called Evening Moscow, the mugshots of survivors. And what I remember most vividly is people lining up on street corners hours before the newspaper would come to be sold in the kiosk to buy this newspaper. There was such hunger for this information. And the other person from this period is someone who also fulfilled that desire to give information to people who were so hungry for it. A young man in his early 20s, barely more than a student. In 1986, this man, Dmitry Urasov, who was a junior archivist at the Soviet Supreme Court, he came across records of millions of unknown cases dating back to the 1930s. One, for example, was the story of director Meyerhold's graphic account of his torture, which Steve quotes in this book. This man, Urasov, secretly compiled index cards on some 123,000 cases, which he smuggled home until he was found out and fired. And after making public his sensational discoveries, the tall archive kid with edgy good looks and a somber manner became a Glasnost celebrity. And by 1989, he was a frequent guest among many people we know and continue to know. So these were people who played an important role in a critical moment. And after the end of the Soviet Union, these characters went their different and separate ways. Milchikov died suddenly and prematurely in his late 1950s. Urasov, we think, went into private business. Anton Ovsienko remains embattled, fiery, running the State Museum in the center of Moscow, next to a Marc Jacobs and Diane von Furstenberg boutique, keeping this property against all odds. And Tanya Medvedev left politics and now lives in Jersey City. So I turn it back to Steve.
So briefly, to try to answer the question with which I began, why would the country be so divided, you having heard all this about Stalin? One possible answer is that the country doesn't know what happened, but that's not true. The censorship ended long ago. There is no censorship of this subject, and anybody who wants to know can know. Television documentaries, television made-for-TV films, Solzhenitsyn's novels have been made into films for television, many others, so they know. They also know, because they're published in newspapers, that the archive documents show that Stalin was personally responsible, that he issued the orders, even the orders to torture people, that he checked names, thousands of names on lists of people he wanted arrested, even indicating what he wanted done with their families. Usually they were to be taken too. So why would about half the nation think Stalin was a great and benevolent leader? The American press, which has indulged itself in Putin bashing for the last decade or so, and therefore misanalyzed most of what's going on in Russia for the last decade, blames Putin. The press, it goes like this: Putin has reintroduced authoritarian norms to Russia, and as a man who came up in the KGB, he personifies a certain method of rule, and this has reawakened pro-Stalin sentiments, kind of in the genes of Russians. The trouble with this theory is it's untrue. It doesn't track historically. When Katrina and I were living in Moscow in the 1990s, we saw the revival of pro-Stalinist sentiments. That's a decade before anybody ever had heard of Vladimir Putin, when Yeltsin was the president. It began in the 90s. So I have a different explanation. I'm not so committed to it that if somebody pointed out something wrong with it or added an explanation, I would resist. But I think that the explanation is twofold. By the 1990s, Russians had no consensual history whatsoever. The Soviet regime had deleted large parts of Tsarist history, and the post-Soviet regime under Yeltsin had deleted large parts of Soviet history as heroic history. Therefore, people had nothing with which to instruct their children. I mean, we all teach our kids historically. We find examples in our history that they should emulate, or not emulate, but something inspirational. The only consensual events in modern Russian history about which people could more or less agree were three: the modernization of peasant Russia into an industrial power in the 1930s, the defeat of the Nazi German invader between 1941 and 1945, and the rise of the Soviet Union to superpower status in the early 50s by acquiring the atomic bomb. All three of these developments had taken place under Stalin's leadership. There was no way you could reclaim these heroic achievements without Stalin. So Stalin began to come back in a funny way. People remembered the achievements and psychologically, and some people politically, deleted the victims. So one understands this psychologically, especially among people who were minimally educated, in pain, as many Russians were in the 1990s, economic pain. So this was the beginning of it. But then something else happened. Most Russians, many Russians, I'd say 65, 70%, thought in the 1990s, and think today, this is the basis of Putin's enduring popularity, that the post-Soviet state deserted them, abandoned them after the end of the Soviet state, abandoned them to oligarchs who took the wealth of the nation, the state property, abandoned them to poverty. About 75% of Russians fell into poverty. It was a very large middle class, Soviet middle class. It was vaporized by the events of the 1990s, abandoned them to crime and corruption. Now, to be fair, some of this was a phenomenon of things that had not been reported when there was censorship, now being reported, rapes, narcotics, and all that stuff. But nonetheless, there was an epidemic of crime and corruption. So Russians began to yearn for, and this is a common theme today, a strong state. But what does a strong state mean? Russians do not, the polls tell us, want a new terroristic, despotic leader. They don't. In fact, a majority of Russians still say, on balance, they prefer democracy, free elections, and an uncensored press. But they want a strong state. A strong state, they say, that will restore order, end crime, restore social justice, and restore their standards of living. That means basically restore the cradle-to-grave welfare state, which is what the Soviet Union was. It had nothing to do with communism. That was just a kind of vague kind of name attached to all this. But when you ask them, as pollsters do, when did we have a strong state, you get a kind of chin-stroking, In modern times, I mean, the Tsarist state collapsed in 1917. You had civil war and all that. The Brezhnev state is generally thought to be when all the troubles began, the stagnation, the unraveling of the Soviet infrastructures. Gorbachev's state led to the end of the state. Yeltsin's state abandoned them, so they're stuck with some memory, sometimes told by grandparents or parents, of the Stalin state as a strong state. Again, they don't mean a terroristic state, but a state that was in control of things. Now, politicians now play on this. Nationalist, communist politicians. And they now rewrite the history of the Stalinist era without the victims. And the reason this now becomes important again is this. The entire Russian political class today agrees that the country has to be, again, because they've been doing this since Peter the Great, modernized, that the infrastructures are shot, that there has to be an all-out push to modernize Russia. One side says the only successful modernization we ever had was under Stalin. Therefore, we have to do it by Stalin. We have to do it the way Stalin did it. They don't mean with millions of victims. They just mean the state has to impose the modernization on the country, like it or not. And the other side says, absolutely not. We've had many modernizations, and the result has always been more tyranny, because the state has done it. And the result has been not citizens, but subjects of the state. So this time, it has to be a democratic modernization. And that's the status of the debate, literally today, November, what's today? 23rd, no, whatever it is, 23rd, in the newspapers, on television in Russia, how to modernize the country, and scarcely a discussion occurs without Stalin's name being used, either as a warning or as an inspiration. So I end the book by saying that the victims' return will not be over until Russia sorts out who and what they were. And that means reaching some consensus about who and what Stalin was. So let us end there, and